You think this old man's an easy target? The voice sliced through the air, dripping with disdain. The young robber's smirk widened as he eyed the frail figure standing in front of him. In the dimly lit convenience store, the man seemed like the perfect mark. Grey hair, hunched shoulders, his clothes wrinkled from years of wear. But what the thief didn't see was the history that lined those worn features, history that wasn't so easily forgotten. Come on, old man. Hand over your wallet, and I won't make a scene. You don't want trouble. The robber's words were heavy with arrogance, as though the old man's frailty was a weakness that would make him an easy prey. He was wrong. The old man's hand stayed still at his side, not moving, not even flinching. The calm in his eyes never wavered, as if he'd been through far worse. I'm not going anywhere, the old man's voice came out low, unwavering. The thief took a step closer, his eyes glinting with impatience. He saw the fear in the old man's eyes, or at least he thought he did. He was wrong again. With one quick motion, the old man reached into his coat, not for a wallet, but for something far more dangerous, a hidden past. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. What he pulled out was a small, simple pin, dull and worn by time, yet it carried a weight far greater than the thief could understand. What's this? You're proof of who you are, the robber laughed, mockingly tapping the tarnished metal. The old man's gaze never left him. The silence between them grew thick. You think I'm just some old man? The words were a mere whisper, but they hit like thunder. And then it happened. The world seemed to shift. The air around them thickened. The store was no longer the small, run-down corner shop it had been moments ago. The sounds of the busy streets outside faded, replaced by the muffled hum of helicopters and the distant crackle of radio chatter. The old man was no longer frail, he was a young soldier again, standing tall amidst the chaos of war. His mind flashed back to the moment that pin had been given to him, a token of recognition for his bravery, a simple but powerful reminder of the countless lives he had saved. The thief's sneer faltered, confusion creeping into his features as he saw something in the old man's eyes, something that made his chest tighten, a sudden recognition of danger. Before he could react, the old man's posture shifted. His movements were no longer slow and deliberate. He was alert, every muscle poised for action. The thief's bravado melted away, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable fear. The old man wasn't just a veteran, he was a legend. The robber took a step back, unsure whether he should run or stay. The silence in the store felt oppressive, thick with unspoken understanding. The thief's hand shook as he realized his mistake. He was no longer facing a frail old man, but a warrior who had once fought alongside generals, a man whose name would freeze a room full of military officers. And now, as he stood face to face with him, the robber realized that the only thing he had underestimated was the old man's silence, because in that silence lay a history of power and courage beyond his comprehension. The thief's smirk disappeared completely as the old man straightened, his shoulders squared, not with age but with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The robber's steps faltered, and for a moment, everything stopped. The store, the sounds of the outside world, and the heartbeat in his chest all froze. The old man's gaze was all it took to shift the tide. The power of years, of sacrifice, and of unshakable strength was now in full view. The thief took a step back, his breath shallow, realizing too late that this old man was far from the easy target he thought he was. Ironically, the robber stood frozen, staring at the old man, who hadn't moved an inch, yet everything around him had changed. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The store, once full of sounds from the city and the clinking of shelves, now seemed eerily silent, as though the world itself had paused. The thief's heart beat faster, his mind racing, trying to process what was happening. The old man hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply shifted. And in that shift, everything had changed. "What's your deal, old man?" the robber stammered, trying to regain his composure, but the words came out weaker than he intended. The old man stood still, his gaze steady, piercing, as though he was seeing straight through the thief. The silence stretched, stretching the tension until it felt like it could snap at any moment. The robber shifted his weight nervously, unsure of what to do next. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his pride held him in place. "I'll tell you this once," the old man said, his voice low and unwavering. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The thief's eyes narrowed, a flash of disbelief in his expression. The old man, despite being hunched and frail, stood with a presence that the robber couldn't quite understand. The kind of presence that made him feel like he was facing something far bigger than he had anticipated. "You're just some old guy," the robber muttered, but there was doubt creeping into his voice now, something he hadn't expected to feel. The old man's eyes didn't flicker. They just held the thief, calm and unyielding. "You think you're the first one to underestimate me?" the old man asked, a faint hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The robber's sneer faltered, and for the first time, he felt a slight chill run down his spine. He had heard stories, old legends, really, about people who had lived through unimaginable things. But those were just stories, right? Just tales. Except now, standing in front of this man, they didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. The old man shifted slightly, and suddenly, the air felt different, like the very atmosphere around them had thickened. The thief could feel it now, a tension that wasn't there before. A quiet strength emanated from the old man, like a well of power that had been hidden, buried beneath decades of silence and age. "I've seen things you can't even begin to imagine," the old man continued, his voice soft but filled with the weight of experience. "Things that made me who I am. And I'm not the kind of man who gets pushed around, not even by people like you." The thief opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He couldn't find them, couldn't match the quiet confidence in the old man's tone. It was as if the very fabric of the world had shifted, and now, he was out of his depth. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The old man's gaze softened slightly, and the thief, caught in that moment, felt something strange: respect. Not for the old man's frailty, but for the quiet power that radiated from him, power that had been earned, not given. He took a step back, his hand unconsciously twitching toward his waistband, where his weapon had once been. But he didn't draw it. Instead, he stood still, unsure of how to proceed. The old man, still not moving from his spot, watched him with a kind of detached calm, as though the situation had already been decided long before the thief had stepped into the store. And then, without a word, the old man turned slowly, almost casually, and walked toward the door. The thief, still frozen in place, could do nothing but watch as the old man left. The world seemed to return to normal, the hum of the city filling the air again. The thief stood there, his mind whirling, the moment replaying over and over in his head. What had just happened? Who was this man, really? The answer was something the thief would never truly understand, but as he left the store, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been face to face with a legend, one that wouldn't easily be forgotten. The thief stood there, watching the old man disappear out the door, the weight of the moment still hanging in the air like a thick fog. For the first time, he realized he had been caught in something much bigger than himself. Something that couldn't be explained by just looking at a man's age or appearance. The old man's footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, growing softer with each passing second. But the thief's mind was racing. What had just happened? Who was that man really? The cold feeling in his stomach began to settle into a pit of confusion. He couldn't shake the thought that he had just encountered someone, who wasn't just a victim of time, but a figure of history, something out of place in a world that had long moved on. He glanced at the store's door, wondering if he could follow the old man, find out more. But then the realization hit him hard: he wasn't the one in control anymore. He was the one who had been caught off guard. His pride, the thing that had pushed him to this point, now felt insignificant. In the back of his mind, he could almost hear the voice of his younger self, the one who had believed that power came from taking, from force, from being the biggest, the fastest. But now, standing in the middle of this store, with the quiet weight of the old man's presence still lingering, that voice seemed distant. The robber ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been the one in charge, the one who decided the rules. But now, with nothing but silence filling the air, he realized that the game had changed. And for the first time, he didn't know the rules anymore. The old man hadn't been afraid. Not once. And it wasn't just because he had been too frail to fight back. No, there was something else there, something deeper. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, the calm confidence that spoke of a lifetime of battles fought and won, not on the physical plane, but in the heart and mind. The robber's hand rested on the counter, gripping the edge as if trying to steady himself. He had seen soldiers before. He had seen tough guys who played the part, wore the gear, spoke the talk. But this man had lived through something more, something that couldn't be faked. The pin he had pulled out, the one that had seemed so insignificant at first glance, now felt like a symbol of something far greater. Maybe it wasn't about the physical power, but the power that came with experience, with living a life where every day counted, where survival wasn't a choice, but a necessity. The silence stretched on, and the thief felt the weight of it more than he ever had before. The world outside continued as normal. People walked by, cars honked, and life went on. But inside that small store, the atmosphere had shifted, and he was left standing there, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had been humbled. Not by force, not by violence, but by the sheer presence of a man who had long been forgotten by the world, but whose legacy couldn't be erased. The old man had shown him something that could never be taught, something that had to be lived. And for that, the robber knew he would never forget this moment, this encounter, as long as he lived. The days after the encounter felt like a strange blur to the robber. Life continued in the same relentless pace it always had, but something was different now, something he couldn't shake off. Each time he looked at his reflection, he saw that same old man in his mind's eye, those steady, calm eyes that had never wavered, the quiet strength he radiated without uttering a single threatening word. The feeling of having been out of his depth lingered in the back of his mind, making every action he took feel strangely insignificant. He tried to brush it off, to tell himself that it was just an old man, that his past didn't matter. But the truth kept creeping back in, a quiet whisper he couldn't ignore. The old man had walked away, leaving him in that store, his heart beating faster, his mind spinning with questions. But it wasn't just the old man's age that had thrown him off. It was something deeper. He had seen that kind of calm before, in veterans who had been through the worst, who carried the weight of the world without it ever showing. But this man didn't even try to appear tough. It was in the way he held himself, the quiet confidence that no one could fake. The robber, for the first time in a long while, started questioning everything. His whole life, he had relied on fear. Fear of being caught, fear of being weak, fear of being nothing. But the old man hadn't flinched. In that single moment, he had completely shifted the balance of power. The robber found himself walking the streets, aimlessly, his thoughts still on the old man. There was no anger, no sense of being wronged, just this strange sense of respect he couldn't explain. He thought back to his own life, the choices he had made, the people he had hurt to get ahead. Was it worth it? The question echoed through his mind like a drumbeat, growing louder with every step he took. He had always been told that power came from taking control, from bending people to your will. But the old man had shown him something else. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about power. It was about understanding. About knowing your worth without having to prove anything. The more the robber thought about it, the more he realized that his entire life had been a facade. He had been so caught up in proving himself to the world, in wearing that mask of arrogance, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply be. To just exist. The weight of that realization started to hit him harder than he expected. Every decision, every action he had taken in his life, had been driven by the fear of not being enough. But the old man, he had been enough, without ever trying to be. The thief stopped walking, standing on a quiet street corner. It was a busy part of town, but for some reason, it felt like the world had slowed down around him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with this new understanding, but he knew he couldn't just go back to the way things had been. He had been given a glimpse of something greater, and now that he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. The old man had walked away that day, leaving the thief with nothing but a memory. But that memory was more than just an encounter, it was a lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The robber's thoughts were like a whirlwind. He had spent his entire life thinking one way, believing that the key to survival was to always stay one step ahead, always be in control. But now, after that brief encounter with the old man, everything seemed different. He couldn't understand it, but he couldn't escape it either. The old man had left him with a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He walked the streets, trying to lose himself in the bustle of the city, but everything felt muted, as if the world had suddenly slowed down. The noises of the busy traffic, the chatter of people passing by, the usual background hum of the city, none of it felt real anymore. The only thing that felt real was the memory of the old man. The way he had stood there, calm, collected, without a single sign of fear. The way his presence had commanded respect without him having to say a word. The more the robber thought about it, the more it made sense. The old man wasn't a weak, frail old man. At all. He had been something far greater, something the robber had never understood, until now. It wasn't about strength or fear or control. It was about living a life with purpose, a life where every action counted, where the choices you made mattered. The robber realized that he had been living a life of illusion, chasing after things that never truly mattered. He had taken from people, hurt people, all in the name of survival, but in the end, it had left him hollow. He had been so caught up in taking control that he had forgotten what it meant to live with integrity, to live with honor. And now, with the memory of the old man still fresh in his mind, he could see it clearly. He had been wrong. All of it. The thief stopped in front of a small park, his mind still racing. The world around him felt like it was moving too fast, and yet he felt frozen in place, caught in a moment that he couldn't escape. He had always believed that the only way to survive was to be tough, to never show weakness. But the old man had shown him something different. He had shown him the power of silence, the strength in knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. The more the robber thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't just facing an old man that day, he was facing a legend, a man who had lived through things that most people couldn't even imagine, and yet he never had to prove it to anyone. The more he thought about it, the more the robber realized that this encounter had changed something deep inside him. He had been forced to confront the reality of his own life, to face the choices he had made. And for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. The old man had shown him a different way, a way that didn't rely on fear or control but on understanding, on living with purpose. He turned away from the park, not sure where he was going but knowing he couldn't go back to the life he had known. Not after this. Not after everything he had learned in that single, quiet moment. The days after the encounter felt like a slow unraveling for the robber. He had spent so many years pretending that he had everything figured out, living in a world where control was the key to survival. But now, the weight of his choices was pressing down on him, and it felt heavier with each passing day. He couldn't stop thinking about the old man, about that quiet strength, the way he had stood there without fear or anger. The memory lingered like a shadow, following him wherever he went. It wasn't just that the old man had been brave, it was that he had been something the robber had never expected, someone who didn't need to prove himself. He had seen it before in war heroes, the ones who carried their experiences with them like invisible armor, but never once boasted about it. It had taken the robber by surprise. No words, no threats, just an undeniable presence. The more he thought about it, the more he began to question his own path. He had always thought of himself as someone who was just trying to survive, but now he realized that survival wasn't enough. He had been living in a constant state of defense, always ready to fight, always running from his past. He had never truly thought about what came after the fight. It was a realization that shook him to his core. He had spent so many years making decisions based on fear, fear of not being enough, fear of losing control. But the old man had shown him that there was another way to live, a way that didn't require him to be in charge of everything. A way that didn't rely on fear or power. It relied on something else, something deeper. It relied on inner peace. The realization came slowly, almost imperceptibly, but once it settled in, the robber couldn't ignore it. He found himself walking the streets, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. People passed by, absorbed in their own lives. But to him, everything felt distant, like he was watching the world through a foggy window. He didn't feel like he belonged in the life he had been living. He didn't know where he fit anymore, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what to do with all these thoughts, these feelings that had surfaced in the wake of his encounter with the old man. It was as if a new path had opened up, one he had never considered before. The path wasn't about taking control, about dominating the world around him. It was about understanding his place in it, about knowing that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. For the first time, he realized that the real power didn't come from force, it came from within. It was a quiet, steady strength, not one that needed to be shouted from the rooftops, but one that others could feel when they were near you. The robber looked up at the sky, feeling a strange sense of clarity. The weight that had been sitting on his chest for so long started to ease. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a choice, like he could decide what came next. And that was a feeling he had never had before. The robber walked through the city, still unsure of where he was going, but something had changed in him. It was as if a fog had been lifted, and for the first time, he could see clearly. He no longer felt the constant pull of fear and uncertainty that had driven his every decision. His past had always been defined by what he had to take to survive, by the walls he had built around himself to keep others at bay. But now, those walls seemed less important. The encounter with the old man had left an impression, not just in his mind, but deep inside him. It was as if the old man had unlocked something inside him, something buried under years of choices made out of fear. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the old man had never needed to speak in grandiose terms to command respect. It wasn't about what he had done, or what he had accomplished. It was about how he lived, how he carried himself. There was strength in silence, in presence. The robber had always thought strength was about control, about taking what was yours and holding on to it. But the old man had shown him that true strength wasn't about grabbing power, it was about owning who you were. For the first time, the robber felt the weight of his past lift. The life he had led, the choices he had made, were all part of him, but they didn't define him anymore. It was a realization that didn't come with shame or regret, it came with a strange sense of freedom. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't go back to the way things had been. He had seen a different path, and though he wasn't sure how to walk it, he knew it was the only way forward. As he walked down the street, he passed a group of people, their lives continuing in their own rhythm, their own routines. For a moment, he stopped, watching them, not with judgment, but with curiosity. He wondered how many of them were living out of fear, how many of them were stuck in patterns they couldn't break. He thought about his own life, about the decisions that had led him here. The old man had made him realize that it wasn't too late to change, that it wasn't too late to make a different choice. He could live differently. He could choose to stop running, to stop hiding, to stop building walls. It was a quiet realization, but it was powerful. It felt like the first step toward something new, something he hadn't thought possible before. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to prove himself, to fight for validation. He didn't need to be the biggest, the toughest, or the one who had the most control. He just needed to be. The realization was liberating, and for the first time in years, the robber felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. The old man had shown him that living with integrity, living with purpose, was the true measure of strength. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting to live. As the days passed, the robber found himself questioning the choices he had made in the past, and yet, he felt something new stirring inside him, a quiet desire to make amends, to live differently. It wasn't a rush, a sudden urge to change everything overnight. It was a slow realization that he had been given a second chance, a chance to take a step in the right direction. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lost. He felt a strange sense of purpose, a purpose he had never sought before, but one that now seemed unavoidable. It wasn't about finding something big to fix, something grand to do. It was about the small, everyday choices. The way he interacted with people, the way he held himself. He thought back to the old man, how he had never raised his voice, never once tried to make a show of power. The old man had simply lived his life with dignity, and that had spoken louder than anything. The robber began to notice things differently. He started paying attention to the way people treated each other, the kindness in small gestures, the way a simple smile could change someone's day. It wasn't always easy to see, but once he started looking, he couldn't stop noticing. There was a beauty and simplicity in the quiet moments that passed unnoticed. The more he saw, the more he understood that life wasn't about taking from others. It wasn't about being on top, or proving your worth. It was about contributing, about finding a place where you could be at peace with who you were. One day, as he walked through the city, he found himself standing outside a small cafe. It was a place he had passed countless times, never giving it a second thought. But today, something was different. He walked in, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window, watching people go by. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't some grand gesture to change the world. But it felt like a step in the right direction. A simple step. He thought back to his past, to the way he had lived his life, and he couldn't help but smile. He was no longer the man who had to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need to take from others, didn't need to hide behind walls of arrogance or fear. He was just here. He felt something new, a peace, a calmness that had never been there before. It wasn't something that could be explained in words, but it was real, and it was his. The old man had shown him the way, not by teaching him lessons, but by simply being. And now, the robber understood. He understood that the greatest strength was not in dominating others, but in knowing who you were and living with integrity. The more he lived this way, the more he felt at home in the world. It wasn't always easy. Old habits died hard. But with each day, the new path seemed less daunting, more natural. He didn't know what the future held, but he no longer feared it. The world was no longer something to conquer, it was something to be a part of. And that, in itself, was enough. Months passed, and the robber found himself a new man. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no grand gestures or sweeping changes that everyone could see. It was something deeper, something quieter that only he felt. His steps were more measured now, not driven by fear or the need to control, but by something that had been missing for so long, purpose. The simplicity of it was both comforting and terrifying at once. He woke up each day no longer searching for ways to take from the world, but for ways to simply be a part of it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but slowly, he started to build a life that didn't rely on taking. He went back to the small cafe, the one he had visited months ago. This time, he wasn't just sitting and observing the world pass by. He was present, a part of it. He smiled at the barista, making small talk with her as she handed him his coffee. It wasn't much, but it was real. He was connecting. In the past, he would have avoided these moments, would have avoided people. But now, he embraced them. He knew the value of the simple things, small interactions, kind gestures, just being present in a moment. As he left the cafe, he walked past the same group of people he had observed before. But today, it felt different. He didn't feel like an outsider anymore. He didn't feel disconnected. He felt like he was part of something. He knew he still had a long way to go, but the journey ahead didn't seem as daunting anymore. It felt like something he could face with confidence, not because he had control, but because he knew his own worth now. He didn't need to prove anything. He wasn't chasing after some illusory sense of power. The real strength, he realized, was in accepting himself, flaws and all. He started volunteering at a local shelter. It was small, but it gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't known before. Helping others, seeing the impact he could have on their lives, was far more fulfilling than any heist or robbery ever had been. It wasn't about grand moments of heroism. It was about the quiet consistency of doing something good, no matter how small. With each day, the man he had once been, the man who lived in fear and control, became a distant memory. That person was still there, buried deep inside, but he no longer ruled him. He had become someone new. Someone who had learned the power of kindness, of giving without expecting anything in return. And as he walked down the street one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, he finally felt at peace. He had made mistakes, but he had learned from them. He wasn't defined by his past anymore. He had learned that life wasn't about what you take, but what you give. And with that simple truth, he knew he could face whatever came next with quiet strength and an open heart.